Hello, everyone. Welcome to AVAIYA University's Healing from Childhood Trauma. I am Ande Anderson. My partner, Ike Allen, and I are the founders of AVAIYA University and Enlightenment Village. Thanks so much for joining us. And in this event, we're talking with some really incredible fellow experts. We're talking with psychologists, we're talking with psychotherapists, doctors, authors, and more about how to heal from your experiences of childhood trauma. And together, we're sharing with you strategies and tools to help you learn to love yourself, let go of your past, live a peaceful, powerful life, and experience healthy, happy relationships. And today our guest is going to be talking about how you can heal fully from trauma. So please welcome Susan Pease Bannett. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Ande. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, and thanks so much for being here. And I'm excited to dive into this today. You are very well known in the topic of trauma and PTSD, and I just thought you would be perfect for this to help people navigate, the past and things that happened to them as kids. So I'd love it if you just first give us a little background on who you are, what you do, how did you get into this line of work?
Okay, that's a big question because I've been doing this for like 45 years.
Excellent.
But yes, okay, so I am a LCSW, which is a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Oregon. I have a private practice set up with a lot of pluses. And because I do work in Portlandia, I have a lot of latitude about the kinds of modalities I can use in my practice because everybody around here is using them and the clients kind of demand them. So I do work holistically. I'm a Karuna Reiki master. I am a Kripalu trained yoga teacher. I also worked for 7 years in training with a Russian Celtic shaman, and I've been studying Druidry for the last year by correspondence in England, just to really dig down into my own roots. And what's been great about that has been finding out that a lot of the Druidic practices are somewhat indistinguishable from other indigenous practices, very, very similar to Native Americans, for example, but in my own genetic and cultural history. So that has been really exciting and fun, which has been great because in working with trauma, 1 hour a week talking head therapy just doesn't cut it. I think everybody knows this who's had trauma for any length of time. And I want to bring kind of the whole package so that people can heal fully.
Awesome. Thank you. So let's dive a little bit into your training. I know that you trained at Harvard teaching hospitals, I think. So you mentioned when we were chatting right before we got started here that this is a very progressive program. So tell us a little bit about that.
So I went to Simmons School of Social Work, which originally was Harvard School of Social Work in the 1920s, and then they sold it to Simmons, but it sits right in the middle of the Longwood medical area. Some of your East Coast people will know what I'm talking about. It's just a street with like all these major hospitals on it, which is great because then everybody goes to each other's hospitals for training and grand rounds and all that kind of stuff. It's a very vibrant intellectual community. And because of Herbert Benson's book in the 1970s called The Relaxation Response, and he was a deaconess, which was down the road from where I was, which was at Beth Israel, the community had really begun to embrace alternative healing in the late 1980s, which is quite early. And so they asked for me to join their team. I had to have 7 interviews to even be an intern in the hospital. But when they found out who I was and my interest in yoga and alternative healing, they put me on the first ever complementary therapies committee with David Eisenberg, who went on to do the landmark study in America that showed that billions of dollars were being spent out of pocket by people on their own complementary therapies, and they weren't telling their physicians about it. And so this kind of rocked the medical world. But this was all coming out of Harvard teaching hospitals. And it's interesting because I live in Portland, and we think of Portland as a progressive area, and it is outside of the main medical establishments. But honestly, where the Harvard teaching hospitals were in the early 90s and late 80s was far more progressive than anything that's going on medically here now.
Got it.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I know a lot of our audience members might consider themselves more progressive or interested in alternative complementary medicines and different ways to help them, work through past traumas. So I love that we're diving into this today. So could you dive, before we get into, right, like a couple of your books and how you help people with trauma, could you talk a little bit about the history, if you have anything more to say about that, of traumatology in general?
Yes, I talk to my clients about it a lot, especially my younger clients, because they don't really have a historical perspective. But I graduated with my bachelor's in 1980, and I started working in residential care centers and group homes and runaway youth shelters and places like this. And I was working at a runaway youth shelter in 1984 when the first book that came out that really rocked the Boston community, it was called Strong at the Broken Places by a woman named Lynn Sanford. And she had realized that, and she worked in the residential care world as well, that her clients all had suffered like severe sexual traumas, and that's where their acting out behaviors were from. And I can literally remember having staff meeting where this was presented, and all of us just kind of like our jaws dropped and the light bulb went on, and we're like, this kid and this kid and this kid and this kid. Because before we were using words like nymphomania or things like oversexed or Oedipal complex to describe these extreme sexual behaviors that we didn't understand. And when we started framing it as an abuse issue, everything started to fall into place and make sense. Bessel van der Kolk and other people had coined the term PTSD for veterans in the 1970s, but it had not been extended yet to people with child abuse issues until the mid-1980s. And the other people that really helped that process were Oprah and Phil Donahue, because they were having survivors on their shows speaking out. And I actually dedicated my first book, The Trauma Toolkit, to Oprah and Phil Donahue, because I really believe that without that mainstream media presentation, I don't think the clinicians would have gotten there, because they were still really entrenched in a lot of psychoanalytic thinking and the idea that this was fantasy or wishful thinking, which is weird, but that's kind of how they thought at that time. And it really just kind of exploded into national consciousness. So that hit Boston in the mid-1980s. And it's interesting because I actually was hired by Bessel once, but they couldn't hire me because I didn't have the right license, but I'd interviewed with him. And he had said in the interview, he said, whatever I write, it takes like 15 years to get into the national consciousness, which seems about right to me. And so, the mid-1980s in Boston, there was an explosion of consciousness, but I think it took, a long time for it to filter into the national and international consciousness. So that's where we are now, is that the field of trauma is actually a really new field, and it's growing all the time. I'm a member of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. It's my favorite trauma organization because they talk about dissociation in a way that other organizations do not. And I've presented with them over 6 times, and I'm on their special interest groups and different things. So we're watching this sort of expansion of consciousness in the field. But I've come to believe that, and I write about this in my second book, which is for therapists, I've really come to believe that trauma is a specialty that should be handled only by specialists. My husband's a cardiologist, and we would never think of sending somebody with chest pain just to a family doc. It's a specialized thing. You have to have a lot of knowledge to pattern recognition. There's special tests you do. And I really think that eventually the field needs to evolve to the place where trauma is acknowledged as a specialty advanced practice, because a lot of therapists aren't good at it, quite honestly. They're not trained in it. They're not good at it. And I and my colleagues get phone calls on a weekly basis from people who've had inadequate or harmful experiences from ordinary therapists about it. So part of my personal mission at this time, besides my practice, is to educate therapists, educate consumers, get the word out about trauma as a field, and help people get trained up and prepared for this work, which is very arduous.
So you mentioned dissociation. Could you dive into what that is for people? You mentioned the institute that you, I can't remember what it was called, but you mentioned
ISSTD. We can call it ISSTD.
Okay. So they talk about that a lot. So what is that for our viewers?
Dissociation is a normal human process and defense. So it runs from normal to abnormal. in terms of how it affects people's functioning. So everybody has had experiences of dissociation. The most common example that people give is what we call highway hypnosis, where you're like driving down the highway and you go into kind of a dream state and you're thinking about things and maybe the argument you had with your boss and blah, 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 and then you miss your exit, right? Because you're not present and grounded and focused, right? And so that's a very common form of dissociation. It's kind of a light hypnotic trance that we get into. When children are, and actually I have a personal example that's not trauma-based, about how children can do this. So when children are young, they go in and out of trance and play states all the time. They live in that world pretty much. Mm-hmm. And the example I like to give my patients and talks is that my sister and I, my mother was pregnant, and so she wasn't paying a lot of attention to us, and we were like 4 and 3 or 5 and 4, something in that range, and we were fighting a lot. And one of us, I don't even remember who, looked at the other one and said, let's pretend we're sisters who get along.
Yes.
Right? And we're like, yeah, I'll call you sis. And I was like, yeah, I'll call you sis. And we're like, yay. And so then we played happily for the rest of the day. Every time we get into arguments, we'd be like, let's be those sisters, you know? And so that's a little form of like removing yourself from the reality into a sort of made up reality that was functional. That actually helped. To this day, we'll still call each other sis, which is kind of hilarious. We both remember that. Yeah.
Got it.
But children in very traumatic situations can engage their naturally creative and dissociative faculties to survive what otherwise might be an unsurvivable response. And I did work on an inpatient unit for 3 to 12-year-olds at a point in my career. And I worked with some kids who did not have the intellect or the ability to do that. And they were, even at the age of 5, they were just throwing themselves in front of cars. Like they just couldn't tolerate being here with that level of abuse. They couldn't get away from it. They didn't have the capacity to actually dissociate away from it. So dissociation, some of my clients call it their superpower. More than one client calls it their superpower, right? Because it's helped them survive and thrive in a way. And of course, that breaks down at a certain point because if you're, not remembering the conversation you had with your partner the day before, and they're frustrated with you, right, things get a little wonky and weird. But ultimately, dissociation is a continuum. So we go from highway hypnosis all the way to multiple personalities, what's now called dissociative identity disorder.
Got it.
And then backing up from that a little bit. So I compare it to cubicles, actually. I describe it like if you're in a room, like your brain is like an office full of cubicles of a normal height. So things are separated enough, they're not just all a jumble, but you can call to the guy in the back and be like, hey, can you pull up the file on, my 6th grade birthday? And they're like, sure, I'll be there in a minute, and you get it, you get the file. With DID, it's like those walls go all the way to the ceiling and you don't know there's anybody else in the room with you. So these files and these things, these neurological things are not available to you, these compartments. In OSDD, otherwise specified dissociative disorder, is just back down a little bit from DID. So you still have compartments, but they're not quite as discrete. So I say it's almost like the walls are almost all the way to the ceiling, but not quite. So you can hear there's murmurings, you can hear there's stuff leaking through, but you don't lose time, you don't rotate out in the same way that somebody with DID does. Mm-hmm. So that's dissociation. And most people, some of my colleagues consider PTSD more of a dissociative disorder than an anxiety disorder, actually. Mm. But there is a dissociative subtype right now in the DSM for PTSD. Most of my clients with PTSD are extremely dissociative. And it's the thing that I think clinicians are probably weakest in because it's more of an absence than a presence. When people are dissociated, they're just checked out and they can look calm, but they're not,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying what that is.
Hi there. This is Ike Allen, founder of AVAIYA. I wanted to take a moment and pause the masterclass to remind you that you can experience many more teachers in the free masterclass at avaiya.com/healing. That's AVAIYA.com/healing. If you're not currently subscribed for the masterclass, please do so now so you can experience all the available classes in this exciting series. And now, back to the masterclass.
Preparing for this interview, I did a little bit of reading, and I know that something that you address in the trauma toolkit, specifically that book, is the physical, spiritual, and esoteric dimensions of trauma. Now, this might be like, when I think about that, I don't think about mainstream, right? It seems like that, like especially like spiritual, esoteric dimensions might not be something that our mainstream culture or, you know, regular maybe healing practices talk about. So can you talk a little bit about how you dive into those specific aspects of trauma?
Sure. So I brought my little friend along, my little Matryoshka doll. And if you look at my book video, I've got, they kind of show it. When you take the doll apart, as people know, there's more dolls inside. So I studied yogic philosophy for 10 years in addition to my training as a yoga teacher. And there's this teaching that comes from Adi Shankaracharya from 1000 AD, and the teaching's been around for longer than that, about the koshas, these subtle bodies and sheaths that encase the human soul, or Atman, which in the yogic tradition is considered non-different than God or spirit or all that is. So it's like whatever we have inside is the same as the God outside. So that's called Advaita Vedanta. That's like non-dual Vedantic Hinduism. The ancient sages and rishis, they really wanted to help people get to that part of themselves, because that's where the bedrock is and that's where the realization is. So they were looking at what is not that, what is not that Atman. And they came up with this system of sheaths. And they said, sheaths surround and interpenetrate this kind of soul, kind of like if God is the ocean, you dip a cup into the ocean, you've got ocean in the cup, but you've got a separate being now. At death, the cup cracks, the water goes back in the ocean, right? Mm-hmm. So the cup, the sheaths, are the koshas. And there are 5 of them in this system. There's the physical body, there's a energy body or prana body, there's 2 levels of mind. So there's what they call the lower mind, the manomaya kosha, which we could talk about it being kind of the brain or the cognitive mind. And then there's a higher mind, intuitive mind, which is also called the wisdom mind or the divine mind. And then there's something called the bliss body, which is a little bit harder for us to understand, but I describe it as like a state of flow. Like when we've been absorbed in something that's very blissful, we don't really know, we don't think about how blissful it is till we drop out of it. And then we're like, oh, that was so amazing. That was so blissful. But when you're in it, you're in a state of no mind. You're just in the moment. You're in a peak experience or a flow state. And there's a book called Flow that's just written about that from a Western perspective. So what occurred to me was like, why at the time, so I have my own personal experience of complex trauma, and it really, I'd had a lot of therapy before it fully broke open, but it fully broke open when I was 42. And at that point I had been working with a shaman, and who happened to have been a therapist for 25 years. So he became extraordinarily helpful and instrumental in my healing. And I was coming out of these states, these seriously dysregulated trauma states, 10 minutes, I'd call him or text him, and 10, 15 minutes, I'd be out of it. And I'm like, what is happening? Like, I don't understand. This clinically does not make sense to me. And so as he educated me and we explored these abilities, and I'd gone to him because I'd had this explosion of psychic abilities in my 30s, and I didn't know how to manage lights coming out of my patients and dead people coming to sessions and kind of weird stuff going on. Like, so that's why I went to him to begin with, and then realized I'd have this deeper level of trauma. So what I realized was that, 1 hour a week talk therapy would not begin to cut it. I had done that with my patients with PTSD prior to my own experience. But the first thing that hit me was like, I didn't realize how physical this process was. I didn't realize how everything hurt, like everything was disrupted. Every system in my body was disrupted. And that's just the physical level. So I realized that at the same time I studied Vedanta, like if I addressed all these different layers, it's like this, if this is surrounding all these layers, right? There's little ones inside, that it's like trauma's like a sword that goes all the way through the koshas. And to heal fully, you had to heal all the koshas. Mm-hmm. So we have to heal the physical body. We have to heal and address the energy body and the mind, but not just the cognitive mind. Like CBT is fine, but it's limited. We have to address much deeper states of mind than that. And then we have to address our ability to experience joy and ecstasy and flow, because that is part of the human gift. And if we can't experience that because we're too traumatized and depressed, we don't want to be here anymore. So we've got to like really engage the healing on all those levels. And when you heal all those levels, boom, like you're done with your trauma. And I can say that as somebody who's been through that, and as somebody who's helping people who are going through that or have been through that in their work with them.
Okay, so let's say someone watching right now, many people watching right now are, resonating with this particular way of looking at trauma. How do they start? Maybe they've done the 1 hour a week talk therapy for years and haven't made progress, or maybe this is new to them and they're looking to start healing now. But where would someone begin on this kind of, I guess, esoteric, right, spiritual journey mixed in with healing from trauma?
There's so many different places to start. I mean, of course, I wrote this book for people to have a roadmap for the healing. And I actually give directions about how to put together your own treatment plan for yourself to heal all these layers. But if you don't want to go to a book to start, like I'd say follow your nose. That's what I did. I kind of was like, this thing's bothering me. I need to heal it. This, I'm drawn over here. Like, go to what lights you up. It might be acupuncture. It might be Reiki. It might be a retreat. It might be, ultra marathoning, right? It might, whatever it is for you, for your body type, for your genetic history. So I talk about, this is sort of complex for a 30-minute interview, but I talk about all these vectors that come in. So we've got an ancestral vector that comes in that with all the genetics and epigenetic trauma. We have our own lifeline vector of our own timeline and our events that have happened to us. But we also have, if you are, as I am, sort of inclined in a yogic way to believe in or experience past lives, then you've got all like your samskaras and some skandhas from past lives. It's also a vector. So this is somewhat complex. We have all these vectors of healing. And what's cool about the yogic technologies I found is that even though they didn't really talk about trauma in the same way that we do, they talk about it as impurities, which gets very mistranslated into our Christian and Judeo-Christian mind. We think of it as like the stain of sin or something. It's not that at all. It's like blockages in the mind and body for healing that is residue from traumatic experience, basically, from this life or previous lifetimes, or our ancestors' lifetimes, right? And so there's a lot of kinds of medicine that know that and work with it, like all indigenous medicine to begin with, Chinese medicine, naturopathic medicine. They talk about these miasms that set up in families. So these kind of ways of healing that we have all around us, available to us in this country, that actually understand this and know how to help people heal from it. Mm-hmm. So when I started, I realized that this energetic whirlpool kept whipping my clients back into their trauma, even though they had processed it. Because a lot of, you hear a lot of people like, why is that person stuck in their story? Well, my experience of why people get stuck in their story is that they haven't addressed the energy body. And when they address clearing the energy body, the story goes away, or it processes out fully, and then it's gone, because the energetic release has to happen. So initially I sent patients to an acupuncturist who was a colleague and friend. And then when I got my Reiki training on board, I realized this was happening with the Reiki. So I don't need to do that anymore. I just do Reiki. And the Reiki takes care of that piece of it.
So energy body, let's dive a little deeper into that. So for people who might be unfamiliar with this language or this work, what's an energy body, and how do people release it?
So the energy body, maybe people have heard the yogic term called prana, or the Chinese medicine term called qi. The idea that there's meridians, there's subtle, they call them subtle nerve currents or nadis in the yogic tradition, that carry energy. Now, I'm one of those people, and there are a lot of people like me who can sense electromagnetic energy and currents of energy. I can feel it. It's palpable. It's like as palpable as, if I'm touching my computer, it's that palpable to me. If you walk in with all kind of schmutz on you from trauma, like I will feel it, like it will make me sick, and I'll have to clear myself afterwards. There are human beings who they're like colorblind. They're electromagnetic blind. They don't have the ability to sense it. I find that people from more indigenous cultures tend to have more abilities. I think I have a theory about this, that conquering cultures are more sociopathic, and they shut down those abilities because it's really hard to hurt or kill somebody if you're feeling their pain, right? So, yeah. So in some ways, I feel like a lot of us were raised in a semi-sociopathic culture where we're taught to shut down and not feel from early babyhood by being put in a separate room, left to cry it out, and blah, blah, blah. It creates great warriors and a certain kind of strength, but there's also huge losses that come with that kind of training and upbringing. And the indigenous and conquered culture. So I'm a half Irish and all Celtic. So like my ancestors were pretty much indigenous people and very oppressed at the same time. You know, the Irish were good warriors, but in my family, there's a real strong line of extreme empathic sensitivity that runs through. So again, comparing it to colorblindness, just because you don't perceive it doesn't mean it's not happening. But in mainstream Western medicine, we have yet to fully embrace and acknowledge this reality and this existence, and also in our science. Some quarters of science do, and obviously the Harvard teaching hospitals do. Like, they brought in visiting acupuncturists from Beijing that teach all the doctors there. Like, you know, in some quarters, this is very accepted and considered sort of our next frontier of understanding medicine. And then in other places, it's considered sort of quackery and hogwash. But most people that I work with, most people who have a lot of trauma actually are sort of fairly empathic and energy sensitive, and what we call now HSPs, are highly sensitive people.
Right.
So healing that energy body is like, it's everything. It's like, because when you get blockages or leaks in that body, you eventually will develop physical issues around that. I had a client, for example, who was grabbed a lot in her upper arm in a very cruel way over and over and over again. And that's in her 70s, she developed bone cancer there.
Wow.
Yeah. And she could track it. She could track it back to that thing, because there was like an energy imprint that was left uncorrected in the body. And I know that sounds, for some of your viewers, that's going to sound really out there. And for some of them, it's going to make perfect sense. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, if this is new, this information is not new to a lot of our audience, but there's definitely, I'm sure some people watching right now, yeah, it's totally new too. And, you know, try to keep an open mind. There are many different ways to be looking at healing from trauma. And that's why we're doing this.
Hi, it's Ike again. I wanted to remind you once more that you can experience many more teachers in our free masterclass at avaya.com/healing. That's AVAIYA.com/healing. If you're not currently subscribed for the masterclass, please do so now so you can experience all the available classes in this exciting series. And now, back to the masterclass.
Could you dive a little bit deeper into yoga specifically? So obviously yoga, you know, there's the philosophy of yoga, and then there's, of course, the physical, you know, postures of yoga. But how can yoga help people heal from trauma?
I think the most accessible yogic practices are probably the breathing practices, because the breathing intersects the voluntary and involuntary nervous system, right? Because we breathe automatically, but we can also hold our breath or breathe however we want. And so the yogis realized that was a quick way in to the nervous system and to calming down the mind. So working with pranayama, there's apps for that. You can get, I think Apple has a breathe app that sort of comes automatically now with their equipment. And there's many ways to breathe that, and I actually put several of them in the trauma toolkit because it's the easiest thing. There's mudras, like just postures, so like just, I don't know if you can see, but just like sitting with your arms like crossed in front of you, called the I Dream of Genie mudra. You know, like it closes your energy field, and it just like, it's comforting. There are simple things. I find that a lot of people do things automatically. Like I used to walk around like this all the time. This is actually a mudra for strength, but I didn't know it. But it just, again, it was like an automatic thing. My body would, sometimes you'll see people just like they don't even know they're doing it. They're just like holding acupressure points,
Right.
touching themselves, right? Like our body knows what to do actually to heal itself if we allow that. So yoga took that body wisdom and kind of turned it into a high science form. And they do call it in India the science of yoga, because they're like, if you do these things, you will get this result, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've noticed more and more. I'm a big yoga fan, and I've noticed more and more how many people are doing trainings and all sorts of things around trauma as it relates to yoga, and how they're utilizing it more for treatment of trauma in various settings. So I find that like fascinating. It just seems to be popping up everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that you get a chance to talk about a couple of buttons below this video. So we have a couple of your books below this video that people can go and learn more about you, and also a free chapter of one of your books. So could you tell us about that?
Sure. So I'm going to put up there's a first aid chapter in the trauma toolkit that is a very sort of detailed summary of a lot of the book. And it's kind of like, I really encourage people to create their own, just like you'd have a first aid kit, to have your own first aid trauma kit handy, and that use the book to help you assemble that. I have a class I give on the book, and it's like all dog-eared, and like, it's awesome. I love to see that. People really working it.
Excellent. And could you make a quick mention of your other book also? I know this is for more clinicians, but we do often have clinicians tuning in. And I know you said earlier that a lot of clients have read this book also, as far as, something helpful.
Yeah, I've been kind of surprised at my level of client interest. This is wisdom, attachment, and love and trauma therapy beyond evidence-based practice. Because evidence-based practice only works, the research is showing, if you have a good relationship with your client. And that's what the research has always showed. I have Harvard mental health letters from like 20 years ago that were saying the same thing. All the meta-analyses show that if you don't have a good relationship with your client doesn't trust you, you got nothing. And if you have it, you got everything. And it doesn't actually matter if you're psychoanalytic or CBT or DBT or ACT. It doesn't matter as long as the relationship is solid and good. And so this book is all about, there's a lot of neuroscience in it. There's a lot of self-care for therapists. There's a lot of talk about love, because I think love heals. And I'm talking about appropriate, and I talk about agape, like a very sort of not a romantic love, not a neurotic love, but a very sort of love from the heart for humanity kind of love, as being that which heals people. Because, of course, people with complex trauma come from a family where there wasn't adequate love, or they wouldn't have been behaving in the way that they were, right? So that's the deficit. And in Chinese medicine, it's called earth energy, and it's connected to the stomach meridian. So it's very key in Chinese medicine too, this idea of being connected to a sort of maternal type of universal love is very important. And I go into a lot of detail about that. There's a lot of science in the book. And what my clients have said, like, I wish I had this book when I was picking a therapist. Because they're like, now I know what kinds of areas of specialty I'd want them to know about after reading the book.
Got it. Awesome. And I think, did you say both of your books, or just one of your books has won awards too? What are those about?
Actually, both. I'm very proud to announce that both books won the Silver Nautilus Award. And the Nautilus Awards are Better Books for a Better World. They're here in the Northwest, and they're not so easy to get. So I'd won one for the Trauma Toolkit. I'm like, oh, I don't know if my second book will get it, but it did. So I'm really happy. Also, your clinician listeners might be interested to know that the Trauma Toolkit was awarded the Alumni Media Award from Simmons School of Social Work. So again, pointing to that Harvard area as being so progressive. I was shocked. Honestly, I was shocked. Even though I know they're progressive, I was like, wow, I didn't know you guys were that progressive. So it's won that award. And it also was a spiritual runner-up in the London Book Fair. So it's, the Trauma Toolkit's won 3 awards, still submitting wisdom, attachment, and love for things. And it got a really excellent review in the New Social Worker magazine. People can check that out.
Awesome.
Well, so I'm proud of these books, and I want them to go into the world to help people. That's the,
yes.
Okay. No author, unless you're J.K. Rowling, nobody's making money off your books. Trust me on that. Nobody. new business card, right?
Yep.
So I want people to read them because I want them to benefit from them.
Awesome. So please, everybody, obviously it's a no-brainer to check out at least one, or if not both of these books, if you're interested in diving deeper into Susan's work and taking a look at this, whole other world that you might not be exposed to as it relates to trauma, because it's, I mean, I'm totally in the world of yoga and, Eastern philosophy and energy bodies and all of that stuff. And it's amazing to, explore our bodies, our like somatics, like all of that stuff is just so fascinating to me in our healing. So I really appreciate you diving into all this and all the work that you're doing and your passion that clearly you have for this topic and putting out all this amazing stuff to the world. So we appreciate it.
Thank you. It's what I'm here to do.
Are there any last insights you want to leave people with before we wrap up?
Yes, keep going. That's my insight. And don't give up, and don't think it should be done in 2 years, because it's a long healing process. It took me a total of about 20 years, honestly. But I'm in midlife and I still have a lot of life to go trauma-free, and it's worth it. Don't think after 3 or 4 years you should be done. You'll be done when you're done, and you'll know when you're done because you won't be suffering anymore. So keep going. Don't stop. If your therapist says, I don't believe in that, or I don't believe you can heal from trauma, all they're telling you is they don't know how to help you. So go find someone who does.
That's right. Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it, Susan. This has been amazing. And thanks for all the work you do in the world and spreading your message. And everybody, thank you so much for tuning into this latest class. And here once again is to your journey to healing from childhood trauma. Bye, everybody. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this latest class with Susan Pease Bannett. She talked with us about how you can heal fully from trauma. Obviously, this is amazing news. You can heal fully from trauma. So she really dove into a lot of what would probably be considered not mainstream topics as it relates to healing from trauma, diving into the spiritual end of things, esoteric end of things, yogic philosophy, and how that relates to healing from trauma. And I just really loved all of the different angles she came at as far as helping you develop strategies and tools and tips and knowledge on how you can overcome this, how you can heal from this. And I also love that she shared her own story, right? She shared her own story of having a very long journey of healing, and that when she, found what was right for her, she was able to fully heal and then teach the world, right? She has these amazing books out. She's, helping people in all walks of life through their trauma, through situations of PTSD, because she healed from her own trauma, and she's a walking testament to the fact that you can too. So I thought that was really powerful. So just a little quick note of when we talked around yoga. So since I am very passionate about the topic of yoga, she mentioned that one of the really simple, accessible things that you can start doing as far as healing from trauma as it relates to yoga is just the breathing exercises, right? They call like pranayama. So just breathing, just tapping back into the breath, getting present to your breath, getting present to breathing in and breathing out, just very simple things that you can start taking on in your day. And that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to a yoga class, not that that wouldn't be a great idea too, but it could just be taking a few moments every couple of hours and just focusing on your breath. Maybe that's like 5 to 10 seconds. Maybe that's 5 to 10 minutes. It's totally, up to you. But just a simple thing as breathing is amazingly powerful. And like I mentioned, I've been seeing more and more of how yoga studios are bringing more people in for workshops specifically on how yoga can help with things like PTSD, that can help with things like childhood trauma. And so I just think it's really, really powerful and something for you to look into if that's of interest to you. So I highly recommend you dive into Susan's books if you're interested in the topics that she talked about today, and really looking into the physical healing from trauma, spiritual healing from trauma, esoteric healing from trauma, alternative therapies, all these kinds of things. So thanks again so much for tuning into this latest class, and we will see you on the next one.